There is a pass high in the Alps, cold, thin-aired, almost empty, where in the autumn of 218 BC something crossed the mountains that Rome had decided could not be crossed. Not a shepherd, not a handful of raiders. A whole army, thousands of soldiers, horses, baggage carts, and a slow grey column of war elephants, brought down through the ice by a commander from the city of Carthage. His name was Hannibal Barca, and with that one impossible march, he made himself into the single figure the most powerful state in the ancient world could not stop thinking about, the name their parents would use for generations to frighten a child into behaving. To understand how anyone ends up leading elephants over a mountain range, we have to start somewhere much warmer and much smaller. A temple in North Africa, a boy of about 9 standing at an altar beside his father. The father was Hamilcar Barca, one of Carthage's finest generals. And Carthage itself is worth pausing on, because most people picture it as a shadow of Rome, when for a long time it was the other way round. Carthage was a Phoenician trading empire on the coast of modern Tunisia, a city of deep harbours, crowded warehouses, and merchant fleets whose wealth came not from ploughing fields, but from moving goods across the entire Mediterranean. Even the boy's name carried their gods in it. Hannibal means, roughly, the grace of Baal, Baal being the great deity of his people. And Carthage had just lost. The first long war against Rome had ground on for more than 20 years over the island of Sicily, and at the end of it, Carthage surrendered the island, paid a crippling penalty in silver, and swallowed the shame. Hamilcar never swallowed it. Legend tells us he took his young son to the altar, placed the boy's hand on it, and had him swear that for as long as he lived, he would never be a friend of Rome. Now, whether those exact words were ever spoken, we can't prove. But Hannibal himself told the story as an old man, decades later, to a foreign king. So something like it happened. And here is the first thing I'd ask you to sit with. This was not a temper that cooled by morning. That child carried the oath for the rest of his life across half a century and 2 continents. That is a very, very long time to stay angry. Hamilcar took his sons west to Spain, and there Hannibal grew up in an army camp rather than a palace, learning the trade of war before he could grow a beard, marching with veterans, watching how men are led. By the time he took command of Carthage's armies in Spain, he was in his mid-20s, and everything he did next was pointed like an arrow at a single target. The spark came at a Spanish town called Saguntum, a place tied by friendship to Rome. Hannibal laid siege to it and took it, knowing exactly what it meant. Rome sent envoys to Carthage with an ultimatum, and, in a scene the Romans loved to retell, one of the ambassadors gathered a fold of his toga and said he carried in it both peace and war. Choose. The Carthaginians told him to let it fall whichever way he liked. He dropped war onto the floor, and the second great struggle between the 2 powers had begun. What Hannibal did next is the reason we're still talking about him. Everyone expected the war to be fought in Spain or at sea, where Rome's navy ruled. Hannibal looked at the map and made a different choice, one so bold it barely reads as sane. He would take the war to Italy by land. He would march an entire army out of Spain, over the Pyrenees, across the great river Rhone, over the Alps, and down onto Rome's own doorstep, where no one was watching the door. He set out in the late spring of 218 BC with a force that ancient writers put at around 50,000 foot soldiers and 9,000 horsemen, and a corps of 37 war elephants, living siege engines that most Italians had never even seen. Getting them across the Rhone alone is one of my favorite small stories in all of ancient history. The elephants would not step onto boats. So Hannibal's engineers built enormous rafts, anchored them to the bank, and covered them in packed earth and greenery until they looked like an extension of dry land. The elephants ambled aboard, the ropes were loosed, and only when the shore slid away did the poor animals realize they had been fooled. A few panicked into the water and simply waded across the riverbed with their trunks raised like snorkels. I promise I am not making that up. And then came the mountains. Here is where I have to hand you my own opinion, because I can't tell this part neutrally. Some people look at the Alpine crossing and see a reckless gambler who threw his army at a mountain and got lucky. I don't. I see the most calculated act of daring in the ancient world. A man who understood that the only way to beat a stronger enemy was to do the one thing that enemy had already ruled out. If you think so too, that this was cold genius and not luck, then go ahead and take his side with a like right now. And if you're sitting there convinced he was one bad snowstorm away from disaster and history simply flattered him, good. Argue it with me down in the comments. I'll read them, because the mountain did not care about any of that. The crossing took roughly 15 days, and it very nearly finished him. It was autumn, and autumn high in the Alps is already winter. Snow lay on the passes, paths narrowed to ledges where a single slip meant a fall no one walked back from. Local mountain tribes rolled stones down onto the column and picked at its edges. Pack animals lost their footing on the ice. Men who had marched across the baking plains of Spain now shivered on bare rock, in air so thin it robbed the breath, wrapped in whatever they had. I've stood at the foot of one of those passes on a grey October afternoon, with a modern coat on my back and a warm car a short walk behind me, and even then the cold reaches in and takes hold of you. Try to strip all of that away. No road, no rescue, just the wind, the white, and a mountain that does not know you are there. There is a famous story, told by the Roman historian Livy, that at one point the army met a rockfall too solid to clear, and that the soldiers heated the stone with fire and then poured sour wine over it until it cracked enough to be broken apart. Whether that's engineering or legend, I genuinely couldn't tell you, but I love that it survives. When Hannibal finally brought his army down the northern slopes into Italy, the force that emerged was a ghost of the one that had set out. Perhaps 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, less than half of what he'd started with, had come through. Of the elephants, nearly all were lost to the cold in the months that followed. One, the sources say, outlived the rest, an animal they remembered as the Syrian. And with this battered, frozen, hungry remnant, Hannibal proposed to take on the greatest military machine in the world. Rome nearly laughed. It stopped laughing at a cold river called the Trebia in December. Hannibal, who read other men the way the rest of us read a page, lured the Roman army out of its warm camp before dawn, hungry and without breakfast, and drew it across the freezing water. While the two lines met, his brother Mago rose from hiding behind the Romans and struck their rear. The Roman army came apart. It was the first proof that this exhausted invader was something the Republic had not faced before. The second proof was worse. In the spring of 217 BC, Hannibal took a shortcut through the flooded marshes of the Arno, days of wading through cold standing water, and somewhere in that ordeal, he picked up an infection that cost him the sight in one eye. He would command for the rest of his life half blind, which somehow makes what came next more astonishing, not less. Beyond those marshes, he laid a trap along the misty northern shore of Lake Trasimene, hid his men in the folds of the hills, and waited in the morning fog. The Roman consul, a proud, impatient man named Gaius Flaminius, marched his whole column straight into the gap. When the fog lifted, The Romans were pinned against the water with the hills full of Carthaginians above them. Around 15,000 were lost or taken. The consul was among those who did not come back. It remains one of the largest ambushes ever sprung. Rome did something it hated to do. It admitted it was afraid. The Senate appointed a dictator, an emergency single ruler for the crisis, an older, cautious man named Quintus Fabius Maximus. And Fabius invented a strategy so unglamorous it drove his own countrymen mad. He simply refused to fight. He shadowed Hannibal across the countryside, always close, never close enough to be drawn into open battle, burning crops so the invaders couldn't feed themselves, wearing him down by patience alone. Romans wanted a hero who charged. Instead, they got a man who waited, and they mocked him as Hannibal's babysitter. History has been kinder. We still call a slow, wear-them-down approach a Fabian strategy, and there is a well-known political society in Britain that took his name precisely because it believed in winning slowly. Fabius understood something his critics didn't. You don't have to beat a genius in the field, you just have to outlast him. But Rome ran out of patience, and that impatience produced the most famous single day in Hannibal's life. In the summer of 216 BC, the Republic decided it had waited long enough and raised the largest army in its history, by most counts around 80,000 men, and marched it out to end the war in one blow near a small town in the south called Cannae. 2 consuls shared command, taking turns day by day, a careful one named Lucius Aemilius Paulus and a bolder one named Gaius Terentius Varro. Hannibal, badly outnumbered, did the opposite of what any manual advised. He placed his weakest troops in the center and his hardest, most seasoned infantry on the wings, and he curved his line forward, bulging toward the enemy like a bow. When the huge Roman mass pushed in, the weak center gave way, slowly, deliberately, exactly as Hannibal intended. The Romans surged into the gap, certain they were breaking through. They were walking into a bag. The strong wings held and folded inward. Hannibal's cavalry swept the Roman horsemen off the field and came crashing back into the rear. And the largest army Rome had ever fielded found itself surrounded on every side, packed so tightly that men in the middle could barely raise their arms. In the space of a single afternoon, somewhere between 50 and 70,000 of them were lost. Let me try to make that number real, because it slides off the mind as just another statistic. Picture a decent-sized town, every single adult in it, everyone you'd pass on its streets in a day, gone from the record between one sunrise and one sunset. That was Cannae. Consul Paulus was among the lost. Varro survived to carry the news home. And then comes the detail I have never quite been able to shake. Livy tells us that the Carthaginians gathered the gold rings from the Roman knights who had fallen, the rings that marked a man's rank, and shipped them back to Carthage by the basketful, 3 bushels of them, and poured them out on the floor of the council as a kind of receipt for the day. I have tried, more than once, to imagine the clerk whose actual job it was to sit and count that heap, and I cannot make the picture hold. If your imagination is better than mine, tell me how that scene looked down in the comments. I genuinely want to read it. Cannae should have ended everything. It very nearly did. After a defeat on that scale, and it was a staggering one, everyone expected Hannibal to march straight on the city and finish it. He didn't. His own cavalry commander, a fierce man named Hannibal, is said to have turned to him and said, "You know how to win a battle, Hannibal, but you don't know how to use one." Whether or not those were the real words, they've echoed for over 2,000 years as the neatest summary of Hannibal's whole tragedy. The truth is more human than a failure of nerve. He had no siege equipment to break Rome's walls, his army was spent, and his real aim was never to storm the city. It was to loosen Rome's grip on Italy so completely that its allies would abandon it and it would have to make terms. Some cities did defect to him, but Rome did the one thing he could not plan for. It refused to break. It raised new armies from the ashes, declared a day of mourning, and then simply carried on and settled in for a long war of endurance that Hannibal, cut off far from home, was slowly going to lose. Because that is the part people forget. Hannibal stayed in Italy for around 15 years, and in all that time, no Roman general ever beat him in a major battle on Italian soil. Read that again. He was, on the field, essentially unbeaten, and he still lost the war. What defeated him was not a better general in front of him. It was distance and time and a divided Senate back in Carthage that never sent him enough to finish what he'd started. His one real hope of reinforcement came from his own family. His brother Hasdrubal gathered a second army in Spain and did the almost unthinkable a second time, brought it over the Alps in 207 BC to join him. But Roman armies intercepted that relief force at a river called the Metaurus before the brothers could ever combine, and broke it. When word of it reached Hannibal's camp in the south, the sources tell us he looked at the news and said he could see in it the fate of Carthage itself. He was still winning his own battles. He had simply run out of a way to win the war. While Hannibal was pinned in Italy, a young Roman had been studying him, learning from his defeats, borrowing his own tricks and turning them back on him. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, and he did the coldly logical thing that finally worked. Instead of chasing Hannibal around Italy, he took the war to Spain and drove Carthage out of it, and then he sailed for North Africa and threatened Carthage itself. Suddenly, the city that had never sent Hannibal enough men was begging him to come home and save it. After all those years, all those victories, he had to turn his back on Italy and sail away undefeated. The two greatest commanders of their age finally faced each other in 202 BC on open ground near a place called Zama. Hannibal had war elephants once more, but Scipio had watched and learned, and he arranged his lines with deliberate lanes running straight through them, so that when the elephants charged, most of them simply thundered harmlessly down the empty channels and out the far side. And the cavalry advantage that had won Cannae for Hannibal now belonged to Scipio, because a Numidian king named Massinissa had switched to Rome's side and brought his horsemen with him. The very weapon Hannibal had used to encircle Rome was turned against him. For the first time in his life, in a major battle, Hannibal lost, and with that, the war was over. Carthage surrendered on hard terms, and the man who had sworn as a child to humble Rome had, in the end, failed to. You might think that's where his story quietly stops. It doesn't, and what he did next is, to me, almost more impressive than the elephants. Beaten in the field, Hannibal did not vanish into a quiet retirement. He went into politics. He became a suffete, a chief magistrate of Carthage, and turned that restless brilliance onto his own corrupt, mismanaged city, reforming its finances so effectively that the wealthy men he'd exposed were terrified of him. They did something small and unforgivable. They whispered to Rome that Hannibal was plotting again, and Rome, which had feared this one man for a lifetime, demanded him. He ran. An aging, half-blind exile, he moved from court to court across the eastern Mediterranean, from one king to another, staying a step ahead of Roman agents who never stopped hunting him. And in the end, in a small town far from the sea he'd grown up beside, cornered at last, he made certain of only one thing: that Rome would never get to parade through its streets the man who had promised at 9 years old that it would never hold him. He was gone at around 64. The oath outlived the boy who swore it, and it outlived him too. Here is what I find almost unbearable and quietly magnificent about all of it. His city lost, his war failed. His name became a Roman byword for terror. Hannibal at the gates, a phrase Roman parents used to hush frightened children for centuries after his own city was gone. And yet the men who beat him could not stop studying him. That trap he sprang at Cannae, the perfect encirclement of a larger enemy, is still taught in military academies around the world today, more than 2,000 years on. Generals in the 20th century built their grand plans around trying to do again what a one-eyed Carthaginian did in an afternoon in the Italian south. You can still stand in the ruins of Carthage on the edge of modern Tunis and look out at the same sea. And up in the Alps, historians still argue about exactly which pass he used, until, in recent years, scientists digging in a boggy high mountain saddle found a churned layer of ancient earth, thick with the microbial traces of thousands of animals passing through, dated to almost precisely his year. After 22 centuries, the mountain finally coughed up a footprint. I'm the voice behind Mystique history, and this is the kind of story I love most. The ones where the person we remember as a monster turns out to be a 9-year-old at an altar, keeping a promise for the rest of his life. If Hannibal moved something in you, stay with me here and subscribe, and then tell me, whose forgotten story, which shadowed corner of the past, would you have me walk into next? Drop the name below. I read further than you'd think. He crossed the peaks that could not be crossed, and he counted in the end a conqueror's cost, undefeated in the field and lost.